Hey everybody, happy December. Hope everybody isn't going too stir crazy during these weird times. Many months ago, I did a studio tour video of all the various synthesizers and gear and the computer and some analog outboard gear and all that kind of equipment. And people have been asking me how it's all wired together. So in the spirit of being trapped inside during the holidays, I am going to present to you as a gift probably the boringest as shit video on how all this stuff is wired together and why I did it. This will be the hardcore wiring and all the individual bits and how they all fit together. I will make another companion video of how all the software ties into all this, and then that way you can see how this has made all this equipment very easy to access and work efficiently with. And that's really it. When it comes to any sort of studio layout or infrastructure design, you want the equipment to be working for you instead of you working for it. You'll see once we go over the diagrams and stuff that there's a huge contrast between the infrastructure and the actual operational flow, which is the only things I have to think about from a tech perspective as I'm working. And that's what's so cool about making all this technology work, is the fact that if you set it up properly, you don't even have to think about it. So let's dive into it. All right, so here we go. This is my studio, Operational Flow 2020, and technically 2021. And actually, it's been like this for over 10 years at various degrees of scale. I'll just point out, yes, my mouse cursor is huge. Someone said it was the size of my ego, but actually I just made it big for these videos so you guys can see what I'm pointing at. Anyway, so let's look at my primary workflows. I have 4 of them that I'm usually jumping between. So my first and primary workflow is composing music and mixing that music in stereo. My bread and butter for composition is writing for cartoons. So you'll see that's why I have Logic and Pro Tools here together. I'll explain that in a minute. But just from a bird's eye view, so I write in Logic. I have a MIDI controller controlling those virtual instruments. I can send MIDI out to outside physical synthesizers and bring all that audio back into Logic, up to 32 stereo pairs. I also have Vienna Ensemble Pro, short form is VEP, which is running standalone, and up to 32 stereo pairs are coming back into Logic. So I use Vienna Ensemble Pro to host my virtual instruments, mainly orchestra sounds, and I'm running it standalone most of the time because it's emulating legacy templates from many years ago. Because when I'm working on multiple seasons of an episodic show, sometimes I have to open stuff from years ago, and that was when I was running more than one computer. So this is actually emulating what I was running on my other computer. So it's almost the same as running Outboard synths. If I turn on VEP and load the appropriate template, the sounds will just trigger if they're assigned to go to that pipeline or not. The other method is running it in a server host kind of way, but I've never really liked it because I always feel like it's a game of moving targets. Like if you update something here and it throws Logic off, Logic might not run properly or it might crash. Whereas running standalone like this is a separate application with its own audio interface. If it is working, the audio just comes back and everything just works. Moving forward from that, all the audio in Logic gets submixed to 8 stereo buses. So these 8 stereo buses coincidentally feed a 16-channel summer, which is 8 stereo pairs. And from here, I can do my final sort of mastering sweetening on that stereo mix. So I have the summer, I can access a whole bunch of analog outboard through the inserts, and I kind of treat it like a mastering chain at that point. And I'll get to that later in more detail. From there, the final stereo mix runs into Pro Tools. And right here it says in position prints. So that means if I'm writing a cue at 6 minutes and 50 seconds, if I hit play in Logic, Pro Tools will also be at 6 minutes and 50 seconds. So the great thing about that is when I'm recording in a whole bunch of different pieces of music on a cartoon episode, I can literally locate to where the cue starts, hit play in Logic, Pro Tools will record, dump it in position, and I can just move on and do the next cue. I don't have to export the cue, re-import it into Pro Tools, make sure it's lined up. I can literally just hit record in Pro Tools and it's exactly where it has to be. And then I can select those tracks, export that as a session, and that's what I send my client. So there's no in-between kind of work, and it saves a lot of time. That's what this LTC sync is here. This is time code coming from Logic and feeding Pro Tools directly, so Pro Tools always knows where to chase. And because Logic is going through Pro Tools, on the outside of Pro Tools, the output section is where I'm monitoring. That's where I'm listening to my final files go down. And this is all I have to think about when I'm working. There's nothing beyond that really, aside from plonking in the notes and balancing levels and just the stuff you do when you're working. So that's my first workflow scenario. This is my second workflow, Logic Prelay Transfers. This is a very specific workflow. It's when I'm doing technical assist for other film composers. We're working on feature films where we have to get all the cues in a movie, which are all the individual pieces of music, prepared and ready for the orchestral record, and when we're passing it down the line to get mixed at Abbey Road or any of these kind of places. The idea here is we're taking each cue and transferring it out to Pro Tools really wide. So instead of 8 stereo buses, I can do up to 96 stereo buses. So it doesn't matter how small or how big the piece of music is, each individual element will get into Pro Tools so the score mixer can mix it properly, put it into surround, put it into Atmos, those kind of things, and they have full flexibility down the line. And just like the cartoon work, it's in position. So the idea is when I'm running off the prep for these films, if there's an hour of score, it should take me not much longer than an hour to run off the entire film score into Pro Tools. And this is amazing for us because this used to take almost a week to do. So we're going from like a week of work down to 2 hours to do a feature film prelay transfer. And if there's any score techs out there, I'd love to hear from you because I've been in that boat where it's always at the 11th hour when you're cramming to get this stuff finalized and out the door. This has saved us so much time. It's working smarter versus opening up all these avenues for mistakes, because when you're printing it this way in position, if I'm listening to a 5-minute cue and it sounds right, Pro Tools has it, and that's exactly how it goes down. Like, because you're monitoring through it, what you hear is what you get. Whereas if you start going in and offline rendering, sometimes something screws up, et cetera, and then you have to go back in and grab individual elements. It just ends up being a huge pain in the ass. The beauty of this as well is it gives the composer more time to write because there's less time dealing with the tech of getting these transfers printed. And just as a side note, this little arrow here, these 8 stereo buses also serve as the scoring demos when we're on the record floor. So if we're recording real orchestra, we have all the individual demos of each of the sections, like strings, brass, percussion, etc. So as we're recording each real section, if we haven't recorded the brass yet, we can put up the brass MIDI demo. And then eventually we'll mute everything until we have all the real elements in and we can hear what the full score sounds like in the reel. As I said before, this is a very specific working scenario, and it's the only reason I had to drive up the cost of my system, because getting these 96 stereo buses into Pro Tools and Pro Tools HDX3 is what costs the money. But it's eliminated so much time that I couldn't be happier. So workflow number 3, this is pretty boring actually. If I'm mixing in stereo or surround in Pro Tools, it's 100% in the box. So there might be some controllers for controlling volume or something like that, and I'm listening to what I'm working on. So that's pretty simple. Workflow number 4 is synthesizer sound design. This is building bespoke sounds for composers instead of just grabbing a generic sound that everybody would have access to. I'll actually build sounds at their request based on whatever their parameters might be. It could be like, we need these drones in the key of E and G, whatever. We want these pulses at these tempos. We want these scary sounds. We want these certain vibes. So I'll build those sounds, and I'll do that on the modular usually. And from here, I can process it through my same analog outboard gear, and I track that into Pro Tools in stereo. And while that's happening, I can also record the 14-channel pre-fader sounds from the modular if I ever want to reopen these sounds later and further muck with them. In these dotted lines here, if I have Logic open, I can send up to 24 channels of voltage control automation, as well as MIDI if I need something really specific, like certain riffs, etc., that are easy to program on a keyboard versus on a modular. And I can also send tempo sync to the modular. So if they need something at exactly 125.5 BPM, I can dial that into Logic and it will tell the modular to run at that speed. So that's my 4th workflow. And as I'm working, this is all I have to think about, just these simple operational flows. So with that in mind, let me show you how it's all wired underneath to make this all happen. And here we go. Okay, so here we go. This is the studio, late 2020, and hopefully for a while until Apple drops the Mac Pro M processor version and fucks me up. But until then, this is how it's laid out. All right, so it all starts with the computer, Mac Pro rack, as you know, and let's turn on our computer layer. So this is pretty simple, and I'm going to turn on this interconnect layer. So based on these colors, these are all the kind of wiring formats I have in the studio. So purple is MADI, the violet's analog, the black is more of the computery connections like USB, Thunderbolt 3, DisplayPort, HDMI, ADAT, if you can believe it. Green is word clock. This brown is 8-channel analog on DB25. Blue is network, and orange is AES. So this is pretty straightforward. It's the Mac Pro rack driving 4 displays, the Cal Digits driving 2 of them, Blackmagic multi-dock for some offline archives, and I have a portable T5 that I float around sometimes. The computer is attached to a gigabit switch because I didn't feel it was necessary to get a 10G switch yet. I'll just wait till those prices drop. If we look inside the computer, we have a U82 Octo DSP card, the Amphitech Squid, which has 6 M2 SSDs in it, the graphics card, I got my Vienna key, my iLock key. There's an RME MADI Face Effects, which is 192 channels of MADI. There's a secondary RME MADI card that has 64 channels, and then we have the 3 AVID HDX cards right here. And these just represent the internal cables for these. This green cable between the RMEs is RME's proprietary word clock sync, so I don't have to loop something through on the outside. So we have the computer in place, and we need to be able to control it. So let's take a look at the controllers. Pretty simple here. We have a 16-port USB 3 hub, which is feeding off the Cal Digit, and there's an iPad that's hardwired. There's a Kensington trackball, a Matthias keyboard, and an M-Audio KeyStation 88 ES. That's my 88 key piano controller, and pretty straightforward so far. So when I was transitioning to the 2019 Mac Pro, I also upgraded my interfaces to use an AVID Matrix. And it's a pretty special box because it does so much in such a small footprint. It's a 2U space rack mount unit, and it acts as an audio interface and a format converter, and it can take a whole bunch of I/O, which is what was really appealing to me because it eliminated so much outside equipment. So let's take a look at our connections between the computer and the AVID Matrix. A lot going on here, but I'll just outline it pretty easily. So each HDX card can run up to 64 channels, so that's 192 channels bidirectional between Pro Tools and the AVID Matrix. This replaces the functionality of cascading multiple AVID interfaces together, such as like the MADI HD or the HDIOs, etc., depending on the cards you populate with this. But as far as Pro Tools knows, you have 192 channels going to and from this interface. So that's how I'm getting that massive pipeline from Logic to Pro Tools. And to accommodate that, here's our RME effects, which is the MADI interface. There's 3 MADI cables coming in, which is 192 channels. I have my 64 channels from the secondary RME that VEP is using for the orchestra sounds. You will notice in the analog signal here coming from the RME, and that's actually the headphone jack. So what I've done is in Logic, I have a dedicated track for the time code, and that feeds this audio output and drives the AVID Sync HD. And that's how I'm getting that perfect timecode sync. It's significantly more accurate than MTC timecode. It's accurate to maybe 4 or 5 samples versus, sometimes MTC is off by like a quarter frame or more. So that's why I'm running the AVID Sync HD. You'll see here the AVID Matrix is feeding word clock to an Apogee Big Ben, but all the Big Ben is doing is redistributing the system clock. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had this here. So we have the primary audio I/O set up right here, and we need to be able to monitor what's happening here. So let's take a look. To turn on my monitoring, you'll see I have 8 channels of analog going direct to a Trinnov Demon 6. The Trinnov is the monitor controller that's adjusting the volume, the speaker calibrations, and so on. And I've also created a bunch of different monitoring sources. So I can listen to Logic's stereo playback, the click, dialogue. I can listen to the stereo analog master from my Outboard gear, which we'll get to. On the digital side, there's 8 channels of AES. It's going to this RME ADI DD, resampling to 96K, and digitally feeding into the Trinnov as well. So the bulk of my work is at 48K, and that means all this is running at 48K, but the monitoring system that's getting digital information is running at 96. So that RME is upsampling so everything talks properly. I wanted the Trinnov to run at 96K just so there was even less latency of processing. That's the only reason why this is here. This is just solving a problem in the background. And you'll notice here, 5.1 set of monitors. I also have a secondary set of monitors here. You'll notice I have a USB volume control knob, which is wired directly into the Trinoff. There's an iPad mini here, which accesses the software control for this and allows me to pick all these different sources. And the cool thing with the Trinoff is I can choose to monitor each one of these individually, or I can sum them together. So I could be like, you know what, I'm writing, I want to hear what Logic's stereo playback is doing, but temporarily I also want to hear the click, and maybe I want to just check out what the dialogue's doing. And I can just turn those on or off. I don't have to deal with it in Logic. It's just set and forget kind of stuff. The Wardbeck MADI meters, this is a 1U rack mount called the 32ME. It basically allows me to monitor any signals I want. I have it set so I'm able to visually see my 5.1 feed, my fold down, dialogue, and various stereo stems. I never have to switch to a different software view to see what's going on. Visually, it's always at my desk. I can see at a glance if a certain stem is firing or not without having to open different software windows and stuff like that. It's a physical meter. So speaking of metering, I also have this TC Electronic Clarity M. It's this little tiny outboard screen that has scopes for surround, it has real-time analyzers, and you can really see what's going on. And it connects to the system via USB. You can access it in Pro Tools or Logic or whatever DAW you use, and you can use it to help make sure your cues are at proper levels. I find the Clarity M is invaluable, especially when writing cartoon music, because sometimes there's hundreds and hundreds of pieces throughout a season, and you want them all to be consistent and level. That way, when you lay up your edit for the episode, the score is consistent. If it's like the biggest epic cue versus the quietest, gentle kind of piece. And that way, the mixer of the show isn't frantically fighting the music track, trying to make it fit into the episode. They can sort of just gently ride their music master. And when that happens, there's less of a likelihood of them just turning the music down because stuff keeps jumping out. So far we've talked about the computer, the audio I/O, monitoring, and controllers. And I had talked about using analog summing and analog outboard gear. Definitely not one of those things that's 100% necessary to do your job. Like, you can do this all in the box quite easily. But for me, it's just a preference. I do love the sound of it, and I love just the physicality of it, being able to grab knobs and touch something tactile. So this is how I've tied that into the system. So from the AVID Matrix, I have 16 channels feeding the Neve 8816 Summer. The main out is your final stereo mix. That goes right back into the AVID Matrix. And this is where things get really interesting on the analog side, because it makes things as easy as using plugins. So all my physical pieces of analog gear are right here. They all wire to and from the flock patch. And then depending on how I have my virtual representation of the patch bay, the flock patch wires all this stuff in any order I want. So if I have my master insert turned on the Neve, I can be like, you know what, maybe I want the SSL G compressor, maybe I want the dangerous back CQ, or maybe I want them in the other order, and you can instantly drag and drop the orders, and it just routes it instantly. It's awesome. Here's a little weird thing I did. So before I had the flock patch, I had a dangerous liaison, which is great, but it's only 6 channel, whereas this is 32. But I kept it in the picture because I can do some interesting things with it from a mastering perspective. So I have it set so if you process stuff through the liaison, I can access the C-bus for parallel compression. I can also operate some stuff in mid-side using the dangerous S&M. If you have a dangerous liaison, the top row, I have it set so it's normal stereo. And if I use the bottom row, it will work in mid-side. So just this little mastering thing here. And my Aurora Audio GT42 is permanently wired here because I use that as like my primary mid-side EQ. So I didn't want to waste a channel up here kind of thing. I'll do another video where I'm actually working on a cue so you can see how this all works, and I'll have my camera hovering over the equipment. All this stuff is acting as sort of stereo mix sweetening. So now we have the computer, the audio interfacing, monitoring, controllers, the analog summing and outboard. Almost last but not least, we have the synths. So this is where it kind of got a little bit more nuts, but it's also invisible tech once you see how it all communicates. So synth layer. This is why I have this massive 16-port USB 3 hub. So I got 4 MIDI Express 128s, and each one of those has 8 MIDI ports, and each one of those MIDI ports feeds one of these physical outboard pieces of equipment. And then I also have another one up here, which feeds the modular. And this whole section is being run by a separate chunk of converters. So I have a Farrowfish A32, two of them, and a Farrowfish A16. All this stuff comes back on MADI. And what that allows is each one of these synths to have a dedicated stereo pipeline into Logic. So I can basically be writing and be like, you know what? I feel like I want to use the Yamaha EX5R. So I literally just press that track, the MIDI automatically goes to that synth, and the audio automatically comes back into the session, and I can even add plugins to it in real time. And that's as complicated as it gets as I'm working. But all it took was all this madness here. Also, because these are AD and DAs, I'm actually using the DA to feed various sampler inputs. So these converters also have ADAT ports on them. So I'm actually using ADAT ports to drive some of the CV automation from Logic. And that allows me to control the modular directly from Logic using these specialized modules. And they are the Expert Sleepers ES3 modules. I have 3 of them, coincidentally. And you'll see here on this converter, I have the stereo mix plus 14 channels of pre-fader sound being converted, and that's just being piped right back into the AVID Matrix. So basically, the AVID Matrix is the mastermind audio interface of the whole thing. And I sort of did a rough tally, and it's dealing with up to 512 channels of digital I/O, both directions, 8 channels of AD, 24 channels of DA. And that's all within a 2U rack mount. So it's kind of nutty that it all just works and it's flawless. And this replaced a whole mountain of equipment. I think I mentioned in a really early video of the AVID Matrix that it uses cards. So that's exactly what this is here. So I have the Digilink cards, one of them is built in. I have a MADI card that's 128 channels wide. There's an internal MADI module that's 128 channels wide. There's 3 8-channel DACs. There's an 8-channel AD, and on it goes. It's handling all the Pro Tools signals. It's handling all the Logic signals, all the synthesizer signals. They're all in different formats. It format converts everything on the fly. You don't even have to think about it. I can't think of a better solution that would allow me to talk to all this gear so effortlessly. So last but not least is dealing with clients virtually. And these clients could be actual music clients. It could be educational kind of things. It could be this YouTube video right now. So there is a YouTube/streaming element to this. So the idea here is my primary 4K monitor is scaled down to 1080p. I have this little Blackmagic box that merges AES and HDMI together. And that AES signal is my stereo mix from my studio system. So whatever I'm monitoring will automatically be injected into this HDMI signal, which is awesome. And then across the room, I'm using 6G coax. So that goes to another Blackmagic 6G to HDMI converter. There's an 8M Mini, and I have my camera and the Rode Wireless Go. And then I have my MacBook Pro, and that would deal with like OBS, Zoom, recording this, etc., etc. So these are all the elements of my studio as of 2020. So computer, audio I/O, monitoring, controllers, analog summing and outboard, synths, YouTubery, and web. And this is how it's all wired up. So the bird's eye view of all the I/O, Logic has 8 analog inputs, up to 64 channel inputs coming from VEP, 192 channels out to Pro Tools for prelays. VEP has 64 channels going to Logic, up to 1,024 MIDI channels, all via IAC. Pro Tools is up to 192 channels of input, 5.1 output, plus a stereo fold down, plus stem metering. So synthesizers, I have dedicated MIDI output ports for each synth in my system, and dedicated inputs for each of those synthesizers coming back into the system. There's 16 channels allocated for the modular and 24 channels of CV control. Analog, 16 channels of summing, up to 8 channels of input to either Logic or Pro Tools. And I can freely patch any of my outboard gear for tracking, modular, or mastering, depending on how the flock patch is configured, as well as a preset change on the matrix. So really easy to flip workflows on the fly. Like within like 5 seconds, I could just flip the entire routing of my studio. Whereas before you'd be like going under the desk and rewiring stuff, and it was just a huge pain in the ass. Controllers are very simple, an 88 key MIDI controller, a few iPads, And then finally, the YouTube and web is literally just 1080p camera, a 1080p scaled desktop. The audio is AES stereo from my studio monitor, which is basically anything I decide to listen to will just be pumped into the HDMI signal digitally. And I also have a wireless microphone lav that's on me right now. And all this is with a MacBook Pro with that A10 Mini, the OBS software and Zoom, etc., etc., etc. So there you have it. This is my studio setup in late 2020, early 2021. Hopefully this won't change for a long time because these technologies are in place now and I don't want to change it. So all that tech I just showed you allows me to run these 4 different workflows effortlessly. And I can switch between them at any time. I could be working on one type of flow and I could get a phone call to change something and I could flip back to the composing and stereo mix under a minute. Whereas before I'd have to go in and unwire things and reset things. And now it's at its peak of efficiency. And that's what really this is all about. Working fast, working efficiently, not compromising, and just getting the work done. Well, you've made it this far. Give yourself a cookie, pour a big glass of whiskey, and slow clap. I know this has probably been some of the most exciting YouTube content you've ever seen in your life. Until the next video. But the next video, I'm actually going to go over this stuff in software. I'll have my camera on specific gear and equipment, so it's just not going to be a diagram. In fact, there won't even be any diagrams other than those 4 little workflow bird's eye views, just so you can see the general scope of things. But otherwise, the camera's going to be on the gear. You're going to have a screenshot of Pro Tools or Logic or both, and I'll show you how I do stuff in real time. All right, until next time, be safe, have a great holiday. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I frequently respond, as you know, and I'll see you next time. Bye.